He's a cognitive scientist at the University of Bristol. His research focuses on how the mind works by writing computer simulations of memory and decision-making processes. His recent work in general focuses on how people update their memories of things they believe turn out to be false, and in particular on the variables that determine whether or not people accept scientific evidence, such as with respect to vaccination or climate science. He's the recipient of a really long list of awards. I'll just mention a few. Discovery Outstanding Researcher Award from the Australian Research Council, a Wolfson Research Merit Fellowship from the Royal Society, and a Humboldt Research Award from the Humboldt Foundation in Germany. He's also a fellow at the Academy of Social Science in the UK and the Association of Psychological Science. It's a much longer list. Those are some things. Today, he's going to be speaking to us on demagoguery, technology, and cognition, addressing the threats to democracy. One last point. Those of you that are watching this via Zoom, please put your questions in the Q&A box on the lower right of the screen. And when we get to questions, we'll sort of alternate between live and questions from the live audience and from the Zoom audience. Okay, with that, thank you, Professor Lewandowski.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction. Thank you for coming. I want to start out by acknowledging my collaborators and funders, because without them, none of that would have happened. And in particular, because three of them are actually sitting right here. So welcome. Thank you for coming all the way from Austria and the UK. Now, the departure point for my talk is the concerning trend globally, or at least in some countries around the globe, that democracy is in retreat. The data you can see up there are by one of several institutions that are tracking the welfare of democracy using a whole bunch of indicators, such as fairness of elections, freedom of the media, et cetera, et cetera. And the way you have to read the graph is to understand that any point below the diagonal has suffered a decline in democracy during the last decade. That is between 2011 and 2021. And my laser pointer disappears as soon as I go on the screen, but you'll find the USA up there in the top right, below the diagonal. And other countries such as Poland, Slovenia, some European countries, emerging democracies, have suffered this dramatic decline. So the question is why? Now, there's no easy answer to this. Obviously, it's a very complex problem. I can't claim to be able to answer all of it, but what I can do is I can pick out three snippets of this multifactorial space that I think are relevant and that I think are interesting to relate to other. And I labeled them demagogue, social media, and human cognition. And the argument I'm making is that both social media and demagogues are in conflict, or at least are exerting pressure onto basic human cognition, while at the same time, there appears to be the symbiotic relationship between social media and demagogues. And that is sort of what I'd like to explore over the next 40 or 45 minutes, starting out with the demagogues. I'm focusing, for starters, on one particular individual who I would classify as a demagogue, former President Donald Trump, who, according to fact checkers, made around 30,000 false claims during his presidency, which I worked to be about 21 per day. So nearly one misstatement every hour, 24/7 of his entire presidency. So if somebody does that, what are the consequences of that? Not just politically, but also sociologically and cognitively. And I'll address both of these issues in turn, starting out with the issue of agenda setting. Who sets the political agenda in public discourse? Now, the conventional wisdom, or at least a large part of it, suggests that the media in Western democracies are principal agents of agenda setting. And when I say conventional wisdom, I'm referring to political science literature from the 1970s, 80s, 90s. And indeed, you can show a causal effect if you run experiments on media coverage. If you change the media coverage, you demonstrably affect public discourse if you run the experiment. So, that is all sort of true. But all of this is also predating the emergence of social media as an opportunity for others to set the agenda above and beyond the media. One person in particular, who I think has been an absolute genius at using social media to set the agenda, is Donald Trump. And I now want to tell you why I think he's a genius in that regard. Going back to November 2016, the sort of Jurassic phase of pre-Trumpian politics in the United States, when Donald Trump had just been elected, but he wasn't president yet. And on this day in November 2016, he started tweeting vigorously. Not sure you can read it, but he is complaining about the cast of a play, a Broadway play called Hamilton, who pleaded for a united America in the presence of Vice President-elect Pence, who was in the audience that night. Donald Trump didn't like it at all. He kept tweeting vigorously, and apparently the public became very fascinated with that. What I'm showing you here are Google Trends search data for the term Trump Hamilton, and you can see that there's an intense spike on that day when he tweeted about Hamilton, perhaps not surprisingly so. Now, what does that have to do with agenda setting? Well, it turns out that this Twitter campaign by Trump coincided on the same day with the release of a $25 million fraud settlement against Trump University that included a $1 million penalty to the state of New York. In other words, Donald Trump had some bad news that day. So did he tweet about the bad news? No, of course not. He tweeted about some random Broadway play. And the public paid a lot of attention, as we can see here. Not only did they pay a lot of attention, they also paid no attention to the Trump University settlement at the same time. The blue line shows public interest expressed as the number of Google searches, and you can barely detect the bump, while at the same time, Hamilton blew away that little bump. Now, this is a nice story, and it's entirely, at best, suggestive. It's anecdotal. It doesn't count for data. So we followed up. And now let me tell you about an experiment where we did collect some data. In fact, we collected the coverage of the New York Times and ABC headline news during the entire period of the Russia Mueller investigation during the first 2 years of Donald Trump's presidency. You may remember this was all about Russian influence, collusion, that sort of thing. And at the time, it was politically quite inconvenient to Donald Trump to have this ongoing problem that was sort of, eating away at his presidency, at least to some point. So we then took all of that text material, related that to Donald Trump's tweets, and we asked the question, how would Donald Trump respond if the media are increasingly talking about Russia Mueller? And then we asked, well, what happens the next day? If Donald Trump responds, how do the media in turn respond to that? Those were the questions we wanted to address. And to do so, I have to explain a graph that I'll show you, which once I explain it to you is pretty cool, but it takes a minute to do that. So what we did in this analysis was to take all possible or all existing pairs of meaningful words in Donald Trump's tweets. It turns out that if you just take pairs, you get a sense of what the content of the tweet is about. You only got 280 characters. Take out all the junk words, stop words. Focus on two, you get a sense of what this tweet is about. And we regressed each tweeted pair on the amount of coverage in the media of the New York of the Russia Mueller investigation in both media and ABC headline news. Now, doing that gives us an estimate of the relationship between newspaper coverage and the occurrence of those two words in a tweet, which we plot along the x-axis. We then looked at another regression model, which is to relate the coverage the next day, because there's a lag in production even today, coverage on the next day as a function of that tweeted pair of words by Donald Trump the previous day. We plot that on the y-axis. So what does that give us? That gives us a space in which each word pair that Donald Trump is tweeting has a location. All right, so here's a pair X, pair Y, pair Z, a whole bunch of pairs. There's thousands of these because there's so many words in Donald Trump's tweets. Now, let's work through what happens under certain circumstances. Well, if there's nothing happening, then all the points should be in the middle. And in fact, if we look at neutral coverage that doesn't affect Donald Trump at all, then we should see that all his tweets are kind of randomly clustered in the middle. No systematic relationship. If, on the other hand, he is specifically responding to the Russia Mueller coverage, then there should be some words, we don't know which, but some words should be over to the right because that means he goes hyperactive on those. And if that's successful, supposing for a moment that could be successful, and the media then reduce their coverage the next day, then we should see a point cloud of some words in the bottom right quadrant. So that's to set up the graphs on the next slide, which are the control graphs. Here we're looking at the economy, football, gardening, skiing, pretty random topics. And what you can see is that pretty much all the points, this monitor isn't terrific, but trust me, there's thousands of little blue points, and they're all sitting in the middle of that quadrant. There's no effect. Nothing falls outside the red lines, which happen to be significance bounds. All right? And the word clouds at the bottom just tell you what the media coverage is about. So, you get a sense of what it is that Donald Trump is not responding to. Okay? Good. So we have stuff where we don't expect anything to happen and nothing happened. But what about Russia Mueller? Well, looks very different. This is what happens when the New York Times talks about Russia Mueller a lot. On the same day, Donald Trump starts tweeting vigorously. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff to the right. That means he's now more active. He's tweeting a lot more. And for some of those words, the next day, the New York Times is reducing the coverage of Russia Mueller, suggesting, if this is causal, and I make no such claim, but suggesting that if it were causal, one interpretation of this is that the New York Times is responding to the diversion of Donald Trump by reducing coverage of the Russia Mueller investigation. Well, is it just the New York Times? No, it's also ABC headline news. And incidentally, this is the only time the ABC News and New York Times are synchronized. Their coverage doesn't correlate at all in other contexts. When it comes to Russia Mueller, the day after Donald Trump tweets, they become correlated. That is, they both report Russia Mueller less. So we can describe the data as follows. Whenever the New York Times talks about Russia Mueller, and that's the word cloud on the left, that's actually what's in that coverage, Donald Trump starts tweeting like mad about those keywords. That are the significant dots in the bottom right quadrant from the figures. They contain those words. He tweets about North Korea, China, jobs, crime, all the things that are his political strengths. And what happens the next day is the New York Times drops Russia Mueller. Now, that's an exaggerated cartoonish display just to explain what we observe. The actual effect size is highly significant, but it is smaller than the visualization indicates. This is simply a animation of what we observe. So it appears that social media permits agenda setting by demagogues. Certainly this one particular individual. But he's not the only one, is he? There are other people out there who are also using social media. So the next question we asked is, was it just Donald Trump? And this is a paper that I'm reporting briefly that just came out in PNAS Nexus, which I'll revisit later in a slightly different context, where what we did was to examine the tweets of all members of Congress between 2016 and 2022. So 1.6 million tweets. And we extracted all the links from all the tweets and checked the trustworthiness of the domain using a rating system published by NewsGuard, which is applying sort of journalistic quality standards to thousands of websites around the world and is constantly examining them, whether they conform to journalistic standards in terms of, publishing corrections, differentiating between opinion and news, et cetera, et cetera. So they're a very reliable indicator, to our mind, of the quality of the domain. But it doesn't relate to individual articles. It is simply about the domain. So is it Breitbart? Is it the New York Times? Is it CNN? Each of those domains will have a different trust score identified by NewsGuard. And what we find is the following. Each dot here is a person in Congress. During that time, there's quite a few of them because people sort of go and then others get elected. So, talking about 1,000 here, I think, in round figures. And this is expressed both by party and ideology. Blue is Democrats, red Republicans, of course. Ideology goes from left to right and is based on an analysis of voting patterns and so on. That gives you a sort of an insight into the position on the ideological spectrum of the person. Anything below that horizontal line where it says none, those are the people who never tweet a link to anything NewsGuard says is unreliable. Now, it turns out there's quite a large number of those people, but most of the dots are blue. Above the line, we have the proportion of times an unreliable link was included, expressed on the log scale, and you find that there, most of the dots are red and clustered on the right, suggesting that the more to the right a Republican is leaning, the more likely they are to share untrustworthy news, and the less likely they are to never do so, to never share untrustworthy news. This graph is expressing the same thing over time and expressed as the average NewsGuard score for both parties. You can see how the Democrats are very high up on that score. They don't change. Republicans decline. And interestingly, they start a slow decline in 2016, but then it becomes more precipitous in 2020 after Donald Trump lost the election. And some of his colleagues went along with him denying that fact. And I think that's where that drop comes from. So this is just a quantitative summary of what American politicians do online on social media. What is interesting here in terms of the previous literature is that there have been several analyses showing that conservatives in America consume more misinformation and share it more than others. And it wasn't quite clear why that is, I would argue. There are various hypotheses, but it wasn't totally clear. We would now suggest we can add at least a hypothesis to that, saying that the Republican leadership is providing leadership by sharing low quality information, which may in turn then signal to the partisans that they should do so as well. So that was my foray into examining how politicians can set the agenda with social media. And what I now want to talk about is human cognition, people at the receiving end of this. What happens to them when they're exposed to some of the things I have just described? Now, my departure point for this is the, to my mind, fascinating observation that throughout Donald Trump's presidency, he was corrected by fact checkers, and the count just kept ticking over and increased and increased. And while that happened, repeated polling showed that 3/4 of Republicans considered Trump to be honest, over and over again, not just once, but in repeated polls throughout the 4 years. Now, to me, that's a fascinating question. How do those two things go together? What is the psychology that is underlying that? Well, a glimpse into this we can find on day one of Donald Trump's presidency, when his press secretary made the claim that his inauguration was the biggest ever that anybody had ever seen. The evidence suggests otherwise. Trump is on the left, Barack Obama on the right, photo taken from the same place at the same time. There's no question that fewer people attended Donald Trump's inauguration than Obama's, contrary to that claim of Donald Trump's press secretary, who, by the way, eventually apologized for that and said, well, I shouldn't have said that. I knew it was wrong. Now, but why do that when it is so obvious that it's false? Well, my interpretation of this goes back to a paper by McWright and Dunlap, where they differentiated between different types of misinformation. And the one thing that I find applies here is what they call shock and chaos disinformation. Now, this refers to disinformation where you sometimes wonder, why would somebody lie about something that is so obviously false? What's in it for them? They just reveal themselves to be, a liar or demagogue. Why do that? Well, I think the answer lies in what I then called an altered ontology of truth. That is that the very notion of what constitutes honesty is redefined. And that is what I now want to explore with a couple of an experiment and then some more linguistic analysis of congressional tweets. Now, these are data from an experiment done within days of the inauguration of Donald Trump, where the experimenters showed participants the two photos you've just seen, Trump's inauguration and Obama's inauguration. And the only thing people had to do in that experiment was to pick the photo that has more people in it. That's all they had to do. And remember now, that wasn't the Trump photo. It was the other one. And now look at the data. People who didn't vote or who voted for Hillary Clinton never made a mistake. They never picked the Trump photo. Well, the 1%, 2%, those are random errors, coffee cups falling onto the mouse, cats jumping on the keyboard, that sort of thing. But Trump voters, on the other hand, that goes beyond accidental errors. 11% for low-educated Trump voters, 26% for high-educated Trump voters. So how can it be that a quarter of highly educated Trump voters are picking the wrong photo? Are they somehow perceptually impaired? No, I don't think so. I think they engaged in what I call and other people have called participatory propaganda. That is, they were expressing their support for Donald Trump in that moment vis-a-vis a presumably liberal experimenter by saying, I know what you're up to. I'm going to click this button because I support Trump. Now, there's some evidence for that conjecture because about a year and a half later, we replicated that exact study and the effect had dissipated. No one picked the wrong picture anymore. Whether the highly educated or Trump voters, Clinton, didn't matter. The whole controversy was gone. There was no point in expressing your opinion that way. So this was a one-time phenomenon in the moment for people to accept a lie and then express it themselves as a signal of support for a politician. And if you look into the political science and sociology of populism, then you find that one of the aspects of populism, which is the sort of binary view of the world between these evil elites on the one hand and the virtuous people on the other, one implication of that is that it also introduces this very different notion of truth as one where the common sense of the real people is always right and the elites are always lying. It doesn't matter what they say. And that distinction, I think, is what is happening with politicians like Donald Trump. Their lies become a signal of authenticity. They signal that they are authentically committed to the real people rather than the elites. I'm committed to you because I'm lying all the time, ha ha ha, and I can get away with it. That is authenticity that populists can thrive on. There's experimental evidence to this. Here's one study by Hall et al., where they manipulated this in the laboratory and were able to turn it on and off, this endorsement of lies as a feature, depending on whether or not the participant thought they were left out or left behind or threatened by a system. Whenever that is the case, when people feel left out, feel left behind, feel threatened by a system such as elections, democratic society, that is when they become susceptible to lying demagogues, as Hall et al. Called it in their paper. And then unambiguous evidence about crowd sizes becomes a signifier of tribal identity. And that is when people engage in the signaling process, just like their leaders. They know it's false, but it doesn't matter. It's a signal of their commitment to buy into that. I've already said that. So let me now move forward. And having set the stage of this replacement of evidence-based honesty with authenticity, let's now look at whether we can detect that distinction between different forms of truth in social media and how that then in turns people's cognition. A very brief commercial break, so to speak. This whole issue of social media and cognition is vast. And if you're interested in exploring that, one possible source is this report for the European Commission that I was the lead author on 2 years ago, which is, reviews all of this stuff in detail and is available at that link, should you be interested. Now, I've already said, or presaged some of this, that there are different ontologies of truth. Let me now very briefly restate that and give you a little bit more of an explanation for what I mean by those two different ontologies before I proceed and show you evidence for their existence. Now, in a democracy, the at least tacit understanding is that truth matters. Truth is something we strive for on the basis of evidence. For something to be accurate or truthful, it has to be, veracity is key. It actually has to be the case. If you're a democratic politician, you will at least on the surface pretend or pay lip service to this idea of truth and evidence being important. Now, a populist politician, on the other hand, as I've already shown through the experiment involving the crowd sizes, a populist politician relies on authenticity. Donald Trump says, don't believe anything you see or hear. Don't believe your own eyes and ears. Listen to me, I'll tell you what's true. So they're replacing evidence with the authentic belief speaking of a politician. Donald Trump is honest when he says the earth is flat, because in the moment he believes that, and he's authentically expressing his belief. And for a populist politician, that is honest, and it is to some extent. If I honestly tell you how I feel about the world at any point in time, I'm being honest in some sense, even if I'm lying to you. And that, I think, is those different truths that we set out now to identify in political speech. Is it the case that when you go to congressional tweets, as we've already done, can we identify two distinct conceptions of truth in that speech? And how would they relate to the accuracy of information being shared? And then how does the public respond to those different types of honesty in political speech? So this is now going back to the analysis of our 1.6 million tweets from Congress persons, which I already mentioned, but which we have now reanalyzed in a different way by focusing on whether or not those tweets express a conception of honesty that is truth-seeking, for short, the democratic notion of evidence, or belief-speaking, the populist notion of authenticity. So we developed a technique to identify these two different components by developing keyword dictionaries. It took a long time to do this, a lot of verification going on, but just so you get a flavor of it, for truth seeking, we started out with words such as reality, examine, evidence, fact, proof. We had a whole bunch of these words that we thought would capture evidence seeking and a truth based on veracity and correspondence with the world. And then on the other hand, we had all these words that we felt represented belief speaking, opinion, feel, common sense, believe, et cetera, et cetera. We developed these dictionaries. They were empirically validated by getting participants online to tell us, we explained to them what we meant by belief speaking and truth seeking, and they then helped us classify these words. And we ended up with two dictionaries. I'm showing you a sample here of the final words that had 37 items in each. So we now have a tool with which we can pick up the ontology of truth in those tweets by Congress people. And we did it not by just counting keywords in these dictionaries, although it can be done, you get the same results, but we did it with a little bit more sophistication, using an embedding model of natural language processing. Now, if you know what GLOVE is or other embedding models, then this will make a lot of sense to you. If you don't know what it is, that's okay too, because I'll just skip over it and point out that we take each word from the dictionary, convert it into a vector representation based on a pre-trained model that tells us about the meaning of this word, both in its local context and globally. Okay, so we now have a much, much better representation of the meaning of these words in the dictionary, and we add them up and average them. And then we do the same thing for the tweets. Whatever is in the tweets, we do the same thing. And we compare the similarity between the two bases of text. So that's all that's happening here. It's actually, mathematically complex, but in reality quite simple. You just take the words, turn them into a representation that is embedded and enriched by their meaning, average it for the dictionary on the one hand, and for text on the other. Now, our main analysis is about tweets by these Congress people. But before we got to the tweets, we thought, well, let's verify this a bit more. Let's look at all the New York Times corpus again, something like 809,000 articles. And let's do the similarity analysis between each article in the New York Times and our keyword dictionaries. And let's work out how truth-seeking and belief-speaking shows up in the New York Times coverage. And what you see here is that in the science section of the New York Times, the similarity of the material to truth-seeking was higher than it was in politics and opinion, which is exactly what we expected. Conversely, for belief-speaking, the similarity was higher in opinion pieces than it was in science and politics. So these numbers don't differ that much, but they're highly reliable because these estimates, because we're talking about 800,000 articles. So what does that tell us? That tells us that our dictionaries are behaving as we expect with respect to this corpus of coverage that one would say ahead of time should be more truth-seeking, should be more belief-speaking, and yes, we pick that up. And we also pick up differences between parties and belief-speaking versus truth-seeking in the congressional tweets. This is illustrating the words and their space, their location rather, in a space formed by belief-speaking on the top, truth-seeking at the bottom, and then the parties identified by color, right and left. And to illustrate, let me show you a full tweet from the top left. So that is a lot of belief-speaking and a lot of Republican partisanship. And the tweet says, Schiff definitely doesn't have an ironclad impeachment case, blah, blah, blah. He surely has himself, though, an active imagination and a boatload of bad intentions. That we would classify as a belief-speaking tweet. Bottom right, just arbitrarily chosen, highly truth-seeking, highly democratic tweet. I will work to ensure there's a fair trial and all of the facts are gathered and evaluated, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you get the contrast in language between the belief-speaking on the left and the truth-seeking on the right. And this is the take-home result. We're looking at belief-speaking on the left, truth-seeking on the right. We're plotting the content of congressional tweets. So each dot here now is a tweet, not a person. And the color-coded lines obviously identify party. And what you can see is that the more Republicans engage in belief-speaking, the less accurate the information is that they share in their tweet. And the reverse is true for truth-seeking. The more Republicans truth-seek, the more accurate the sources are that they link to in their tweets. We can also look at the destination, so to speak, that is the content of the link being shared. We looked at all the articles, 160,000 of them, that were shared in tweets by Congresspeople, harvested them, applied our dictionary analysis on that in the way we've described it, and we find precisely the same pattern. The more Republicans engage in belief-speaking, the lower the quality of information they share. And the reverse is true for truth-seeking. Democrats are largely unaffected by this. But for Republicans, the use of belief-speaking is a marker of whether or not they're likely to share something that's accurate. I mean, Republicans are perfectly happy and capable of sharing accurate information if they engage in the language of truth-seeking. So the conclusion from this, bottom line, is that truth-seeking commits a speaker to be honest in the sense of being accurate. And that seems to be the case irrespective of partisanship. If you engage in truth-seeking language, then chances are you're accurate, irrespective of party. If you engage in belief-speaking, then it depends. For Democrats, expressing belief was not shown to be associated with a reduced accuracy. But for Republicans, the moment they engage in belief speaking, that is a signal that they are likely to change, to share information of lower quality. So that's the take-home message from that analysis. Now, I do have a few minutes left, according to my watch. Just about 5, 3. Okay, that's fine. So, what about the public? How does the public respond to this? Well, that was the next part of this analysis. We now looked at the replies to the tweets from members of Congress. The analysis I just showed you told us what the Congress people were tweeting. Now, what does the public do? Well, the public replies on Twitter. You know, they can reply. And we harvested those replies. And we then asked, okay, how does the rhetoric in the replies align with the rhetoric of the tweet that was being replied to? Now, there are 2 possible outcomes. One is that if I tweet belief speaking, you reply in kind. Or if I tweet a belief speaking tweet, you might say, no, 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 and you reply with truth seeking. It could be the case, or some combination of those things. Well, the title of the slide explains the table beneath. What we find is fairly strong evidence that the style of the tweet is setting the agenda for the ensuing conversation, and that irrespective of whether it's a Democrat or Republican, if there is more belief speaking in a tweet, there's also going to be more belief speaking in the replies. And the same for truth seeking, again, across party lines. The more truth seeking, bottom 2 numbers, the more truth seeking in the replies. In other words, the leadership is setting the tone of the conversation. If they indulge in belief speaking, so will the public in reply. If they engage in truth seeking, so will the public in reply, statistically, more so. These are obviously statistical association, but if you look at a plot of the data, it shows up very clearly. So, leadership matters, and leadership can determine the tone of the conversation, and the public will follow suit. I think that's a very important conclusion, and I will stop here. Thank you for your attention, and pose this as a question for the discussion, perhaps. Now that we know all that, what are we going to do about it? Thank you very much.
Okay, so we'll take questions from.
No. You probably want to use the mic for that.
Thank you so much. Very thought-provoking. Early on in your presentation, you were showing the tweets and how they affected news coverage, what Donald Trump was tweeting.
Oh, yes, right.
And that there was
Yeah.
less news coverage of the Russia Mueller case afterwards. Did you happen to see whether the media began picking up
On
what
this.
what Trump was talking about, the jobs?
Oh, right. No, that's a very good question. We looked at that. No, and we didn't pick it up. We did not pick that up. It wasn't as simple as him saying jobs, 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 and then the New York Times is talking about jobs the next day. That did not happen. What happened was that when he talked more about jobs in North Korea, the New York Times dropped it the next day, the Russia Mueller thing. And we also had, I mean, there's a lot more to that study than what I showed you. We also had a control case in politics, namely Brexit. Because the good thing about Brexit is that it overlapped almost completely the discussion with the Russia Mueller phase. There was a lot of stuff in the New York Times about Brexit, but unlike Russia Mueller, it wasn't a threat to Donald Trump. Quite on the contrary, Brexit for him was something that he was, supporting. And the Brexit data are just like gardening and skiing. It's right smack in the center. Complete randomness. There's, yeah, he doesn't respond to Brexit, and the New York Times doesn't respond to him. But Russia Mueller, bang, there was this unique cluster of words in that bottom right quadrant.
So the answer you just gave may partially answer my question, but I'm wondering, in terms of the media response to Trump's tweets, how do we know it's not just regression to the mean? When you look at gardening and skiing, those are not terribly topical, so I wouldn't expect there to be fall off the next day. The Mueller investigation was so, here's the news of the day. So you could argue that, like many hot news topics, might disappear the next day from the New York Times coverage just because the news cycle moved on.
Yeah.
And I don't think Brexit is really an adequate control, given that for the United States, it's further away, and so there's not the same immediacy and speediness of the news cycle.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting idea. I mean, I can't rule that out. Okay, except I can sort of rule it out because we had about 100 control variables in these regressions, including autocorrelations with the coverage from the previous day. So if there was a trend of hot topics cooling off over time, we would have picked that up independent of Donald Trump's tweets. I mean, that regression model I showed you there had just the tweets in there, and then I think there were a couple of dots. Well, those dots were 100 more variables, literally 100 more in the regression, accounting for a time trend, week of the year or week of the period. I don't know. I mean, I shouldn't say temperature of the day because that wasn't in there, but I mean, it was like 100 things we could think of that might explain it. And that would have, the autocorrelations would have picked that up.
We have a question from the Zoom audience.
To what do you attribute this abrupt shift toward increased belief speaking among Republicans between 2016 and 2020?
Well, Donald Trump, I think. And this is the only thing you can detect in data from within the Republican Party. Let me give you a few more examples. Republicans, the party of law and order, love the FBI, don't they? Well, they used to until Trump became president. And then all of a sudden, Republican trust in the FBI plummeted and was then below that of Democrats. I don't know if that's recovered, but Donald Trump, boom, we hate the FBI. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, went up by 30 percentage points, okay, between 2015 and 2016 or 17, among Republicans. Higher education, Republican views on higher education, they used to favor higher education as being good for the United States, not as much as Democrats did, but by a 2-to-1 split until 2016. Next survey, 2018, flipped around. Republicans now, in their majority, think universities are bad for the future of the United States. So you can put you take any timeline of Republican opinion, you put in 2016 and Trump election, and afterwards, lots of things were different. Approval of Putin, dislike for the FBI, dislike for universities. It all happened then. So I think it's Donald Trump, simple as that. Yes.
I mean, it's really kinds of misinformation. And corruption of journalists, that leads to mass incarceration of journalists. Past government performance are to be much cognitive dissonance among people. Offset against the kind of valid observation that potentially government performance misinformation matter more
Well, it's a very interesting question and observation, and I don't really have an answer to that. I mean, I do have a fairly specific answer to some types of misinformation that we know are harmful. For example, during the pandemic, there was quite a bit of evidence to suggest that watching Fox News kills people. I hate to say it, but it's as simple as that. Why? Well, because you can show by very clever statistics in an instrumental variable analysis that the marginal effect of additional Fox News watching leads to less social distancing, higher infections, and greater fatalities in that particular market of cable TV. Okay. And how do we know that there is a marginal effect on Fox News coverage? By the position of Fox News on the menu. It turns out there are thousands of cable markets in the United States, and the menu alignment or assignment in each of these cable markets is arbitrary. And sometimes Fox is high, sometimes it's low. And the higher it is, the more people watch it just because they see it. Okay? It's as simple as that. So you can isolate that effect statistically. That couldn't possibly, in my opinion, be related to COVID, right? How the hell would the menu position of a TV station cause people not to social distance unless it is them watching that station? And there's been a number of those analyses showing that misinformation about COVID has had discernible public health outcomes. There's also causal effects that were observed in Germany with Facebook, where the variable of interest was local outages of Facebook. Apparently, Facebook falls over on occasion in little towns in Germany. And whenever it does, people don't have access to Facebook for 2 days. Hate crimes against refugees declined. Okay, so you can identify that statistically. We just published a paper about a week ago in Nature Human Behavior that looked at 500 articles, did a systematic review of the effects of social media on democracy, and all of that stuff is in there. So that's a partial answer to your question. Yes, exposure to misinformation has identifiable, demonstrable adverse consequences, but that's the granularity I can engage in. I can't go deeper than that and say different types of misinformation have different effects. That I don't know.
Thank you for your interesting talks. At one point, you were talking about other demagogues and maybe lesser
Yes.
demagogues or demi-demagogues. And I was hoping that you might have named some, or you might name some, but it seems like to your question, what can we do, that we could maybe disconnect or disallow demagogues from using social media, especially Twitter. Of course, with Elon Musk, that may not happen. But I also thought that in your value speaking, that hoping that you had 5 minutes left, that you that maybe you have an answer to the question. I'd really like to hear your answer.
About what to do.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. So, okay. So, well, the last thing was, can I answer that question? And who are the other demagogues? Okay, well, I was thinking of people like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Johnson in the United Kingdom, and then the Italian Meloni. And then, of course, every country has them. The Austrians have their freedom-loving, what do you call them, the FPO. The Germans have their AFD. They're not always in power, but they're all they're singing from the same sheet. So can I answer that question? Well, shall I answer that question? How much time do I have? Oh, easy. Well, defanging the demagogues. What can we do? Well, one thing you can do, there's a lot of things you can do. And this is another whole talk. I want to draw attention to one thing that few people know about, and that is the role of deliberative assemblies. That is mini publics that have demonstrably been able to come to conclusions about very complex and controversial issues. My favorite example is Ireland. They've had 2 referenda, one on gay marriage, one on abortion. Can't think of anything that's more hot button than those 2 topics. And the country didn't blow up One of the reasons it didn't blow up is because each referendum was preceded by a year-long deliberative assembly constituted of 99 randomly chosen citizens who got together a full weekend each month. They received expert input, submissions from the public. They sat around all day and talked in breakout groups and all that under moderation by a respected Supreme Court justice. And their recommendations were made public. This is the sum total of their recommendations. Single page of abortion, I think. Is this abortion? Yes. It's not gay marriage, but they did a similar thing for gay marriage. And the amendment passed. Abortion is now legal in Ireland, and there's very little populism in Ireland. One of the reasons I think that's the case is because the Irish public felt represented in these deliberative assemblies because they knew they could have been in there. And they were televised. You can find this on YouTube. Fascinating watching. It's random people coming to a decision, but outside the reach of Twitter and demagogues and tabloids and so on. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing you can do is you can redesign the internet for democracy. That's a big task. Why is it necessary? Well, I don't know if you know Shoshana Zuboff. I think she's at NYU. She says you can have Facebook or democracy, but not both. I think that's a little bit, actually, no, it's not over the top. I think it's actually quite right. So what can you do? Well, Peter Pomerantsev and I had a paper earlier this year where we sort of sketched out an internet for democracy. What does it actually mean? And one of the things it means in a lot of ways is more transparency. Why do you see an ad? What are the algorithms doing? Who is behind campaigns? Who's funding it? And you have the right to customize the interface to give you, something that is compatible with democracy. And just to add more to that, I think the European Union has launched two legal initiatives, one called the Digital Services Act and the other one called the Revised Code of Conduct for the platforms that are taking a major step in that direction. For example, under the DSA, which comes into effect within the next year or two, the platforms must give access to data to independent researchers to allow auditing of their algorithms. And commercial considerations cannot prevent that. It's pretty strong language. A lot of people say it's not enough, but I think the glass is at least half full. And that's another talk for an hour or so because, but I don't have time. You don't want me to spend that much more time. So does that answer your question a little bit? I'll pause there again because I think you want.
Want is the wrong word.
Oh, end, stop, okay.
Because I would love to keep this going. Actually, since we started a few minutes late, if you have time for one more question, maybe?
Yeah, sure. The lady in the back, her hand went up.
Actually, here.
Oh, I'm sorry. We'll spend the remaining time being polite to each other. That's nice.
After you.
I was just wondering, in the data that you shared about belief speaking versus truth speaking words, there's like an increasing category of fake signs.
Yes.
So has that also been sort of figured in? Because words like analyze, examine come all the time there.
Yes, that's very interesting. I'll repeat the question for the Zoom audience. Is there a similar dictionary about fake science, detecting fake science, facsimile science, as Naomi Oreskes calls it? Well, we haven't done that, but there is a paper out there by Memoretchik and Penny Cook. I know how to say Penny Cook. He was second author. The first author had a very complicated name. That was published, I think, in 2012, where they compared the language in the IPCC, that is the official intergovernmental panel on climate change, to the NIPCC, which is the non-governmental, which you hopefully have never heard of because it's a publication by the Heartland Institute, which is a Koch brothers fossil fuel funded so-called think tank. So basically, it was a denialist screed, and they compared the linguistics between the two. And it's very interesting because what you find is that the deniers are completely certain about everything. Oh, we're sure we don't have a problem. Others, yeah, we're sure. Yeah, just, don't worry about it. It's not happening. We're sure. The IPCC is much more tentative. We have reason to suggest, with overwhelming evidence, that we may have a problem. It's kind of that science speak, very balanced and sort of, it drives me crazy sometimes now, how nuanced they are to the point of obfuscation. The deniers don't have that problem. And the same appears to be the case with COVID, anti-vax stuff or anti-COVID stuff. They're always sure, And so certainty, I think, is a good marker for pseudoscience. If people are certain, they're probably telling you a furphy.
Okay, well, I wish we could keep going, but so I could get my half dozen questions in, but I'm afraid we're out of time. So thank you all for coming,
Thank you.
and let's thank our speaker today.